On your guitar journey, you might have come across something called the 4-cable method, sometimes posted on forums and websites as 4CM. And you might be thinking to yourself, what is the 4-cable method? Why do I need a different way of hooking up my guitar, pedals and amplifier? What is the difference between the 4-cable method and the regular method that I'm using at the moment to hook up all my gear? Well, let me tell you. What is up, guys? My name is Ben Hartwell. Thanks for checking out the channel. If it's your first time here, or even if you've been here before, why not hit that subscribe button? So, the 4-cable method. First off, what is it? It's basically a way of setting up your pedals and your amplifier so that the pedals give the optimum tone that they're designed to do. It's a way of splitting your effects into two different categories. Those that you want in front of the amp or in front of the preamp of the amplifier, and those that you want to go into the effects loop or after the preamp section of the amplifier. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm quite happy using my effects the way I am at the moment, all in one line and plugging straight into the front of the amplifier. So what benefit is there really to using a more complicated method like the 4-cable method? We see with certain tones, especially heavier sounds, running some pedals into the front of a really distorted amplifier can give you undesirable effects. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so I've got my V30 plugged into the matching cabinet behind me, and I've got two different pedals. I've got a Tim Pierce overdrive that I'd usually plug straight into the front of the amp, and I've got the Strymon timeline that I would usually plug into the effects loop. But for this first tone, I've just plugged the overdrive into the timeline and straight in to the front of the V30. So this is just the overdrive channel of the V30 without the delay turned on. So let's turn that delay on. So you can hear there how pronounced those repeats are. That's because each of those repeats is hitting the front of that distorted amp and getting amplified really loud. Let's change this round to the 4-cable method. Okay, so I've not changed any settings. All I've done is plug the timeline into the effects loop rather than straight into the front of the amp. So if I turn it off for a second, let's turn that delay pedal on. So there you can hear how much cleaner those repeats are. And remember, I've not changed any settings. All I've done is move that pedal from being in front of the amp into the effects loop. So there you can see, just by moving a pedal and not changing any of the settings on it, from being in front of the preamp to after the preamp, you get drastically different results. That's not to say that one is better than the other. You might want to go for the sound of that delay pedal in front of the amp and really like the tone that that gives you. But for me, I really like having the clarity and the control of running delay pedals through an effects loop. And it's not just delay pedals. For me, most time-based effects really sound their best when run through an effects loop. But as with all things guitar related, it is subjective and it all depends on the kind of sound that you're going for. So that's the difference really between running things in front of the amp and running things through the effects loop. But how do we set it up? Let me show you. Okay, so let's do a 4-cable method setup. So the first cable that we need is the one that comes from the guitar. That is going to go into the first pedal that's going to go into the front of the amplifier, which in my case is going to be this Tim Pierce overdrive pedal. You would then connect all the pedals that you want in front of the amplifier after that pedal. But in my case, I'm just going to do one just so I can show you. The second cable in the 4 cable method is then going to come from those pedals to the front of the amplifier. Okay, so that's all the pedals that we want in front of the amplifier done. Now it's time for the effects loop. And this is where some people get confused. So with the amp's effects loop, you'll see 2 sockets, usually labeled send and return. And those 2 sockets are doing just what it says on them. The send is sending a signal out from the amplifier, and the return is the audio that you are returning back to the amplifier from your pedals. So I've already plugged the 2 cables into the effects loop on the back of the Victory, which is these 2 blue cables here. So all I need to do now is connect them into the in and out of the timeline. And that's it, 4 cable method done. So the 4 cables that the 4 cable method refers to are the cable from your guitar to your first effect, the cable from the effects that you want to run in front of the amp to the amp, a cable from the effects loop send of your amplifier, and then a cable from the last pedal to the effects return of the amplifier. So you can run the 4 cable method with any amplifier that has an effects loop. Now there are all kinds of different effects loop. That Marshall behind me has 2 different effects loops built into it, one serial and one parallel. You can get the same kind of effect from using most effects loops. It's just going to be a case of trial and error. All an effects loop really is an insert between the preamp and the power amp, where we can insert whatever kind of effects we want to. One thing I did forget to mention is if you're using just a clean amplifier or just using the clean channel on an amplifier and not relying on the amp itself to make your overdrive or distortion, you're relying on pedals for that instead, is you can forget about your effects loop. It really won't make that much of a difference. So you may as well get the best tone you can just by plugging straight in to the front of that amp. So there you go, that's what a 4 cable method is, and that's how you set it up. In my opinion, although it is a much more complicated setup than just plugging straight into the front of the amplifier, if you are using a lot of effects, I think the 4 cable method is a much better way of using them. It keeps all your effects nice and clean, and you can dial each and every one in to the exact sound that you're after. That's not to say that you might not want to put some of those effects right into the front of the amp, because that might be the tone that you're going for, but for me, using that effects loop really does give me the best tone. One warning that I will give though is that some effects loops do suck some tone. I found in the past that with some amps and some effects loops, I do end up losing some top end or a little bit of signal or just a little bit of something, and nothing really sounds as good as just plugging straight into the front of an amplifier. But if you are using effects, especially time-based effects, then for me, an effects loop is definitely the way to go. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up below. If you want to watch another video on my channel, you can click just here. Don't forget to subscribe. You can do it right there. I'll see you in the next one.